The ships came in the morning. They came from the north, in formation, moving slowly through the harbor waters off the coast of Sicily. Roman warships, dozens of them. The soldiers on board had done this before. They had besieged cities, broken walls, taken ports. They were experienced, disciplined, and methodical. The Roman military machine of the 2nd century BCE was probably the most effective siege operation the ancient world had yet produced. It had taken cities far more formidable than this one. It was not expecting difficulty. On the walls of Syracuse, the people watching from the city's battlements did not look calm. They had reason to be afraid. Their city had been drawn, against the wishes of much of its population, into the war between Rome and Carthage, a war that Rome was increasingly winning. A Roman general named Marcellus was commanding this fleet. Marcellus had taken cities before. His soldiers were veterans, and there were a great many of them. But something was happening on those walls that the soldiers approaching from the water could not yet fully see. There were structures up there that had not been there before. Strange mechanisms of wood and rope and counterweight, arranged along the battlements at intervals. Some were positioned to point downward, toward the water. Some seemed designed to project outward over the walls. There were beams that could swing. There were baskets and hooks suspended from enormous cranes, and there were what appeared to be launching devices, capable, it seemed, of throwing things. Large things, a long distance. The first assault began the way Roman assaults always began, with organization, with confidence, with the slow and disciplined advance of forces that knew exactly what they were doing. And then things started going wrong in ways that the Romans had no framework to understand. Projectiles came from directions that didn't make tactical sense. Stones were being hurled with precision that exceeded anything the Romans had encountered. Ships that got close to the walls found themselves suddenly grabbed by great iron hooks on the ends of cranes, the hooks dropping into their hulls, and the cranes lifting their prows out of the water, tilting them, threatening to capsize them. Men who had fought in a dozen campaigns froze, not because the weapons were particularly new. Catapults and cranes existed before this moment, but because the way they were being used, the combination of them, the precision of them, the sheer systematic thoroughness of the defense, that was unlike anything they had seen. Marcellus, watching his assault fall apart, is recorded to have made a dark joke about it. He said that Archimedes was using his ships to ladle water from the sea as if they were buckets, and that his army had been disgraced, driven away from the walls by some old man in Syracuse who was using their ships for a kind of parlor game. It was not a compliment, but it was, in its frustrated way, an acknowledgment of something real. One person's thinking was holding off an army, not one person's courage or one person's military genius in the conventional sense. One person's understanding of how the physical world worked, of levers, of counterweights, of trajectories, of the relationship between mechanical force and the objects that force could move, was doing something that walls and soldiers and moats alone could not do. That person was not a general. He was not a king. He was not even a soldier. He was a mathematician. He was a man who had spent his life, up to this point, working on problems about circles and spheres and the nature of infinity. Problems that seemed to almost everyone around him to have nothing whatsoever to do with the real world. And yet here was the real world, very specifically not going the way the Roman military had planned it, because of exactly those kinds of problems. His name was Archimedes, and the most important thing about him was not what he built. It was how he thought. If you enjoy stories about how powerful ideas can change history, about the minds behind the moments, consider subscribing. There is much more of this to come. Syracuse in the 3rd century BCE was not a quiet place. It was one of the largest Greek cities in the Western Mediterranean, a wealthy, active, politically complicated city-state built on a peninsula jutting into the Sicilian coast. It had harbors, trade, a substantial population, and the perennial political turbulence of a city that sat at the intersection of competing powers. Syracuse had been fought over, allied and reallied, governed by tyrants and by more democratic arrangements, pulled toward Carthage, pulled toward Rome, always navigating a political geography that rewarded flexibility and punished commitment. This was the world Archimedes was born into, probably around 287 BCE. His father, according to the ancient sources, was an astronomer named Pheidias. This detail is small but significant. It places Archimedes in a family where looking at the physical world with systematic curiosity was not unusual. It places him in a household where the movements of stars and planets were things you tried to understand rather than merely accept. Growing up in that kind of environment does something to how a child relates to the question of why the world works the way it does. The broader intellectual environment of the Greek world in this period was itself remarkable. Greek-speaking culture had spent the previous 2 centuries developing something that had not quite existed before. The habit of asking fundamental questions about the structure of reality and insisting on reasoned answers, not divine explanations, not mythological frameworks. Reasoned answers, the kind that followed from principles you could state clearly and test against observation. Philosophy, mathematics, astronomy, what we would eventually call physics. All of these were being developed simultaneously, and the people working on them knew about each other, read each other, argued with each other. The center of this intellectual world, in Archimedes' time, was not Syracuse, but Alexandria. Alexandria was the great library city, the place where Ptolemaic Egypt had made the extraordinary investment of collecting and organizing virtually all the written knowledge of the Greek world. Scholars came there. Ideas were exchanged there. If you were intellectually serious in the 3rd century BCE, Alexandria was where you went, at some point, to encounter the full range of what human thinking had produced. Archimedes went. The sources are not entirely clear about how long he spent in Alexandria or exactly when, but what is clear is that he formed significant intellectual connections there. He knew the mathematicians and astronomers working in Alexandria, people like Conon of Samos, who would become a close friend, and Eratosthenes, who would famously calculate the circumference of the Earth with remarkable accuracy. These were not casual acquaintances. Archimedes corresponded with them throughout his life, sending them his new work, engaging with their responses, maintaining the kind of intellectual dialogue that sustained serious thinking over long distances. But what matters more than where he studied is how he thought. And the quality of Archimedes' thinking that stands out most clearly looking back at his work is this. He was not satisfied with knowing that something was true. He needed to know why it was true. And more than that, he needed to know it in a way that was so complete, so rigorous, so thoroughly worked through, that it could not be doubted. This might sound like a standard description of a mathematician, but it is actually a fairly rare intellectual disposition. Most people, encountering a fact about the world, accept it if it seems consistent with their experience and move on. Archimedes could not move on. A problem that was not fully understood was a problem that kept pulling at him. A demonstration that worked in practice but could not be explained in principle was not satisfying. He needed the principle. This disposition shows up in how he worked. His written treatises, several of which survive, which is remarkable given how much ancient writing has been lost, are constructed with a kind of architectural care that is striking even to modern readers. He states his assumptions clearly. He builds his arguments step by step. He does not skip over difficult parts or wave at them vaguely. Each conclusion follows from what came before it, and the whole structure is designed so that someone who follows it carefully cannot reasonably come to a different conclusion. This is mathematical thinking at a high level, but it is also, more broadly, a way of relating to the world, a refusal to accept confusion where clarity is possible, a commitment to following an idea all the way to its foundation rather than stopping when you have enough to get by. Archimedes lived this way, not just in his mathematical work, but apparently in how he engaged with everything around him. The ancient sources describe someone who was often so absorbed in a problem he was working on that the physical world, mealtimes, conversations, the movement of people around him, simply failed to register. He was not ignoring the world. He was seeing a different layer of it. The layer where shapes have properties that never change, where relationships between quantities hold true always and everywhere, where the logic that governs a circle in Syracuse also governs a circle in Alexandria, or in Rome, or on the moon. That permanent, abstract layer of reality was where Archimedes actually lived. The physical Syracuse around him was, in a sense, just the surface. There is a question that children sometimes ask that adults have mostly stopped asking, not because they found the answer, but because they got used to not knowing it. The question is, why does that work? Why does a heavy thing fall faster than you can run? Why does a long stick make it easier to move a rock than a short one? Why does a boat float when a stone of the same weight sinks? These are questions about the physical world, about the everyday experience of living in a world with weight and balance and motion. And for most of human history, the answer to all of them was essentially the same. That is just how things are. Some things are heavy, some things float. Long sticks are useful for moving rocks. This is simply experience, and experience is enough. Archimedes was constitutionally incapable of this answer, not because he was arrogant about what he knew. By most accounts, he was genuinely humble about the limits of his understanding, but because, for him, the question of why the world worked the way it did was not a question you asked once and set aside. It was a question you kept asking until you had an answer that was actually an answer, one that explained the thing, not just described it. Take the lever. Levers are ancient technology. The basic principle that a bar balanced on a pivot point can be used to move heavy objects was known and used long before Archimedes was born. Farmers used levers. Builders used levers. Anyone who had ever used a crowbar or a simple scale was using the principle of the lever, even if they had never named it. The practical reality of levers was entirely familiar. What was not familiar before Archimedes was the why. Why does a lever work? What determines how much force you need to apply to one end to lift a given weight on the other? Is there a precise relationship between the distances from the pivot point and the weights involved? And if there is, which anyone who had experimented with levers would suspect there was, because you can feel the difference when you move your hand closer to or further from the fulcrum. can that relationship be stated exactly and proven rigorously? These are the questions Archimedes asked about levers. Not how to use them. He knew how to use them, everyone did. But what, precisely, was happening when you did? And, working through that question carefully, he arrived at what we now call the law of the lever. That a lever is in balance when the weight on each side multiplied by its distance from the fulcrum is equal. This is a simple statement, but what is behind it is a complete theoretical understanding of how mechanical force works through a rigid bar. The same quality of attention went into his thinking about other physical phenomena, floating and sinking, the behavior of fluids under pressure, the way forces act on curved surfaces, the relationship between the weight of an object and the weight of the fluid it displaces. In each case, the ideal starting point was a familiar physical reality. Everyone knew that some things float and some things sink, and the ending point was a principle that explained the reality completely in terms of relationships between measurable quantities. This is the beginning of what we now call physics. Not the specific results, though many of those have held up for more than 2,000 years, but the method, the idea that physical phenomena are governed by precise mathematical relationships that can be discovered through careful reasoning and expressed in terms that are always and everywhere true. Before Archimedes, this idea was not fully formulated. After him, it was impossible to ignore. There is something worth pausing on here, because it is easy to read backward from our present knowledge and make what Archimedes did sound straightforward. It was not. The idea that the physical world operates according to mathematical laws that can be discovered by human reason is not obvious. It requires a leap, a willingness to believe that the messiness and complexity of everyday experience is, at some level, orderly in a very specific sense. Not just roughly patterned, not just generally consistent, but precisely mathematical. That leap is what we call the scientific worldview, and Archimedes was making it before anyone had given it that name. He was also doing something else. He was turning the world into problems. Not in a cold or detached sense. There is nothing in the ancient accounts of Archimedes that suggests he experienced the physical world as a collection of equations to be solved and then set aside. It seems rather that, for him, every physical phenomenon was an invitation, a puzzle that the world was presenting and that he could not walk away from until he understood what it was actually saying. Weight was a question. Balance was a question. The way water moved around an object submerged in it was a question. He lived surrounded by questions, and he found this not burdensome but endlessly interesting. That mindset, the disposition to see the ordinary world as full of problems worth solving, is part of what made him exceptional. You do not need unusual intelligence to ask why a lever works. You just need to decide that the question is worth asking seriously. Most people never make that decision. Archimedes made it about everything. Some stories survive for more than 2,000 years because they capture something true, even when the details may have been improved in the telling. The story of Archimedes and the crown is one of these. The basic situation was this. Hiero II, the king of Syracuse, had commissioned a new crown made of gold. He suspected, but could not prove, that the goldsmith had replaced some of the gold with cheaper silver, keeping the difference in weight constant so the crown would weigh the same as the gold he had been given. The crown looked like gold. It weighed the right amount. But was it pure gold, or was it a mix? This was a practical problem with a political dimension. If the goldsmith had cheated and you could not prove it, you had no recourse. If you could prove it, the goldsmith would face serious consequences. But how do you determine whether an irregularly shaped object is made of pure gold without melting it down, which would destroy the crown? You cannot simply weigh it against a block of gold if the cheat has compensated for the density difference by adjusting proportions. You need some other approach. The story goes that Archimedes was given this problem and could not immediately solve it. He was thinking about it, the way he thought about problems, which was continuously and all-pervasively, when he got into a bath. The bath was full. When he lowered himself in, water spilled over the edge. He noticed this. He noticed, specifically, that the volume of water that spilled out was equal to the volume of the part of him that had entered the water. And, in that moment, looking at the water on the floor, something connected. The story says he ran through the streets shouting Eureka, the Greek word for I have found it, without stopping to dress. This is almost certainly embellishment. But the core insight it is illustrating is real, and it is worth understanding clearly, because it is a beautiful piece of thinking. Here is the idea. Gold is denser than silver. This means that a given weight of gold takes up less space than the same weight of silver. If you put a crown made of pure gold into water, it will displace a certain volume of water. Exactly the volume that the gold itself takes up. If you put a crown made of silver into water, it will displace more water, because the same weight of silver takes up more space. And if you put a crown made of a mix of gold and silver into water, it will displace a volume of water between those two amounts. So, here is what you do. You take a block of pure gold that weighs exactly the same as the crown. You put both into water, one at a time, and you measure how much water each one displaces. If they displace the same amount, the crown is pure gold. If the crown displaces more water, the goldsmith substituted some of the gold with a less dense material. The difference in displacement tells you exactly how much substitution occurred. This is the principle of displacement, and it is not just a clever trick for detecting fraudulent crown makers. It is the seed of what we now call the study of fluid mechanics. The principle that an object submerged in fluid displaces a volume of fluid equal to the object's own volume is foundational to understanding how fluids behave around solid objects. Archimedes worked out the full theory, including why things float. What determines how much of a floating object sits above versus below the waterline, and the precise relationship between an object's weight, its volume, and the weight of the fluid it displaces. This body of work, collected in his treatise on floating bodies, was the most rigorous analysis of fluid behavior that existed for the next 1800 years. But step back from the technical details for a moment and look at what the insight actually was. Archimedes was not thinking about water displacement before he got in the bath. He was thinking about the crown, and what allowed him to see the connection was a quality of attention that kept the problem alive in his mind. Not actively, in the way you actively think about something you are sitting down to work on, but as a background condition. The problem was always there, and his mind was always, at some level, looking for pieces that might connect to it. This kind of thinking, where the active and passive modes of cognition are working simultaneously, where you are simultaneously focused on other things and still somehow available to the problem, is what allows insights to arrive at unexpected moments. It is not magic. It is not divine inspiration. It is what happens when you have been thinking hard enough about a problem for long enough that your mind has built up a rich set of connections around it, and then some small piece of new information, water overflowing a bath, provides the key that makes everything organize itself. Eureka! Not as a shout in the street, but as the quiet internal moment when a pattern becomes visible that was not visible before. That moment is what Archimedes spent his life in pursuit of, and he found it with remarkable regularity in places that nobody else had thought to look. He is supposed to have said, "Give me a place to stand, and I will move the earth." The statement sounds like the boast of someone who has lost perspective on what is physically possible. And in a literal sense, it is impossible. There is no place outside the earth to stand, and even if there were, the lever you would need would be unimaginably long, and the time it would take to move the earth by any measurable amount would exceed the age of the universe. As practical engineering, it is not a useful proposal, but as an illustration of a principle, it is perfect. Because what Archimedes was saying was this: there is no theoretical limit to how much force a lever can amplify. If you make the lever long enough and position the fulcrum correctly, any force, no matter how small, can theoretically move any weight, no matter how large. The relationship between force and the distance from the fulcrum is precise and predictable. Understanding that relationship means understanding exactly how much you can achieve with whatever force you have available. This is the lever principle, and it is one of those ideas that looks simple once it has been stated and seems obvious in retrospect, but that required genuine intellectual work to arrive at rigorously. What Archimedes did was not just observe that levers are useful, that had been known for millennia. What he did was prove, with mathematical rigor, exactly how levers work. He derived the precise quantitative relationship from first principles, treating the problem the same way he treated geometry, with stated assumptions, careful reasoning, and a conclusion that follows necessarily from what came before. The proof matters, not just the result. Here is why. If you know that a lever works but you do not know precisely how, you can use it only by feel, by experimentation, by trial and error, by the accumulated practical wisdom of people who have been using levers for generations. That is useful. It got the pyramids built. But it has limits. You can improve your technique incrementally, but you cannot engineer systematically. You cannot calculate in advance exactly what lever length and fulcrum position you need to achieve a specific result. You are always working empirically, always testing rather than predicting. If you know the principle precisely, if you can calculate, everything changes. You can design rather than just improvise. You can predict what a mechanism will do before you build it. You can optimize. You can apply the principle in contexts that are very different from the contexts you originally tested it in, because you understand the underlying relationship rather than just the specific cases you have encountered. This is the difference between craft knowledge and theoretical knowledge, and it is an enormous difference. Archimedes took this further. He did not just work out the lever. He worked out the pulley, the compound pulley, the winch, and the relationships between them. He understood that mechanical advantage, the ability to amplify force, could be achieved through multiple different mechanisms, all of which were expressions of the same underlying principle. He understood that these mechanisms could be combined. A pulley system could be combined with a lever, and the advantages of each would compound. And he understood the limits. Mechanical advantage always comes with a trade-off. If you can move a heavier weight with less force, you do so by moving your force through a longer distance. The total work, in the precise physical sense of force multiplied by distance, remains constant. This last insight, the conservation of work across mechanical systems, is a profound one that would not be fully formalized until the 17th century. But Archimedes was already reasoning in ways that pointed toward it. He understood that mechanical devices do not create something from nothing. They convert, redistribute, amplify within constraints. Understanding those constraints was as important as understanding what the devices could do. The demonstration of the compound pulley, according to the ancient sources, was vivid and public. Archimedes rigged a system of pulleys to a ship, a large, fully loaded ship sitting in the harbor at Syracuse. He invited King Hero to watch, and then he moved the ship himself with one hand, using the rope of the pulley system. A single person, without any particular physical strength, moving a ship that would normally require a crew of many people to maneuver. The king and the crowd watching apparently found this deeply impressive, and Hiero is reported to have said that from that day forward, Archimedes was to be believed in everything he said. The demonstration worked not because of a trick or an illusion. It worked because of a precisely understood principle, applied correctly. That is the power of a simple idea, properly understood. Not the idea as vague intuition, but the idea as rigorous knowledge. The kind you can apply in specific situations to achieve specific, predictable results. There is a point at which mathematics stops being a collection of useful techniques and becomes something more. It becomes a language. A way of describing reality that is more precise than any other language available, that can capture relationships and structures that words alone cannot express, that allows you to reason about things that are impossible to visualize directly. Archimedes worked at that point. He was not just solving individual problems. He was building the vocabulary for an entirely new way of talking about the world. The work on geometry is where this is most visible. Archimedes took the tradition of Greek geometry, already highly developed by Euclid and his predecessors, and pushed it into territory that had not been reached before. He worked on circles, he worked on spheres, he worked on cylinders and cones and their relationships to one another. And he did something that, in the context of ancient mathematics, was genuinely revolutionary. He worked on curved shapes in a way that required thinking about quantities that approach a limit without ever reaching it. Consider the problem of the area of a circle. You can see that a circle has an area. If you draw one on paper and fill it in, it takes up a certain amount of space. But how much exactly? The area of a rectangle is easy, length times width. The area of a triangle is also manageable. But a circle has no straight edges. Its boundary is curved. The simple formulas for rectilinear shapes do not apply directly. How do you calculate the area of something with a curved boundary? Archimedes' approach was to think about what happens when you inscribe polygons inside a circle and simultaneously circumscribe polygons outside it. An inscribed polygon, a hexagon, say, or a 12-sided figure, fits inside the circle and is smaller than it. A circumscribed polygon of the same kind fits outside the circle and is larger than it. The area of the circle is somewhere between the two. Now, what happens if you increase the number of sides? A 24-sided inscribed polygon is closer to the circle than a 12-sided one. A 48-sided one is closer still. As the number of sides increases, the inscribed polygon approaches the circle from below, and the circumscribed polygon approaches it from above. The gap between them gets smaller and smaller. Archimedes used this method, which we now call the method of exhaustion, to determine the value of pi with unprecedented precision. He calculated that pi lies between 3 and 10/70ths and 3 and 1/7, an accuracy that was not surpassed for many centuries. But more important than the specific result was the method. The method of exhaustion is a way of reasoning about limits, about quantities that are approached but never quite reached. That is the direct ancestor of calculus. Archimedes was doing proto-calculus in the 3rd century BCE. He did not have the notation. He did not have the general framework. But the essential reasoning, that you can determine exact values of curved quantities by examining what happens as an approximation process converges, was there, fully operational in his work. He applied the same method to spheres, to cylinders, to parabolas, to spirals. In each case, the work was not just about finding a specific answer, but about developing the method, demonstrating that curved quantities could be subjected to the same kind of rigorous analysis as straight-edged ones, that the apparent barrier between geometry and the kinds of shapes that actually appear in the physical world was not as absolute as it might have seemed. His result about the sphere and the cylinder is one he was particularly proud of. He proved that if a sphere is inscribed inside a cylinder, touching the cylinder's sides and both circular ends, then the surface area of the sphere is exactly 2/3 of the total surface area of the cylinder, and the volume of the sphere is exactly 2/3 of the volume of the cylinder. The same ratio, 2/3 for both surface area and volume. This is one of those mathematical results that is beautiful, not just in the sense of being elegant, but in the sense of being surprising. There is no obvious reason why it should be the same ratio for both, and yet it is, necessarily, because of how geometry works. Archimedes found this result so significant that he reportedly requested a sphere inscribed in a cylinder be carved on his tomb. Math, for Archimedes, was not a tool that you picked up to solve a problem and then put back down. It was the structure of reality itself, visible to anyone who looked carefully enough. The curves of the physical world, the arc of a projectile, the shape of a water surface, the geometry of a rolling wheel, were mathematical objects obeying mathematical laws. And the laws could be discovered, proven, and stated in a form that was perfectly precise. This conviction, that mathematical reasoning could give you access to truths that observation alone could never quite reach, is the foundation of the entire scientific enterprise that would eventually follow. The stories people told about Archimedes during his lifetime and immediately after are interesting not primarily as biography, but as a kind of portrait, an attempt to capture in anecdote the quality of a mind that did not work the way most minds work. There are several accounts of him becoming so absorbed in a mathematical problem that he lost track of everything else. He would be drawing geometric figures in ash or sand, the way mathematicians of his era often worked, tracing shapes on whatever surface was available, and would continue even when interrupted, even when someone was trying to speak to him, even when the interruption was urgent. His body was physically present while his attention was elsewhere, in whatever space mathematical thinking occupies. His servants, according to the sources, had to essentially force him to eat and bathe. They would have to remind him that he had not eaten for hours. He would comply with the immediate request and then immediately return to the problem. The physical needs of living in a body were, for him, interruptions to what he was actually doing, rather than the baseline reality that thinking was an occasional departure from. This kind of absorption is something that mathematicians and other deep thinkers across history have described, often using similar language. A quality of concentration that is not effort in the normal sense, where you are forcing yourself to focus on something you would rather not be doing, but more like the opposite. A state in which everything else falls away because the thing you are thinking about is so interesting, so demanding of exactly the kind of attention you most like to give, that ordinary reality simply cannot compete. It is not that Archimedes was indifferent to food or to the people around him. It is that, in those states, they simply did not register. There is a contrast worth drawing here. Syracuse was not a quiet city. It was politically turbulent, commercially active, full of the ordinary noise and urgency of a significant Mediterranean port. Kings made demands. Wars were fought nearby. Trade created its daily pressures. The city had a public life in which prominent citizens were expected to participate, to offer opinions, to take positions, to be visible in the way that mattered for social and political standing. Archimedes does not seem to have found this world particularly compelling. Not because he was hostile to it. The ancient sources describe him as generous and as generally well regarded by those who knew him. But because it was simply less interesting than the interior world he spent most of his time in. The political arrangements of Syracuse, the commercial fortunes of its merchants, the social hierarchies and personal rivalries of its prominent families. All of this was fine, presumably, but it was not the kind of problem that kept him up at night. The problems that kept him up at night were, what is the exact ratio of the circumference of a circle to its diameter? Can you calculate the area under a parabola with precision? Is there a general method for finding the volumes of curved solids? These were not urgent questions in any practical sense. Nobody's life depended, in the immediate term, on a precise value of pi. But they were urgent to Archimedes in the way that urgent questions are urgent. They were unresolved, and he could not stop thinking about them until they were resolved. This quality, the obsessive, all-consuming engagement with problems that are intrinsically interesting regardless of their practical value, is something that recurs in the histories of people who have pushed human knowledge significantly forward. It does not seem to be a choice exactly, or at least not a choice made fresh each day. It seems more like a disposition, a fundamental feature of how a particular mind relates to the world. Archimedes did not decide to be obsessed with mathematical problems. He simply was, and the world around him organized itself, for the most part, in accommodation of this fact. Until the world had other plans. The war between Rome and Carthage, the Second Punic War, as historians would later call it, was reshaping the entire political geography of the Mediterranean world. Hannibal had crossed the Alps with his army and was fighting in Italy itself. Rome was stretched. Carthage was pushing hard on multiple fronts, and the cities of Sicily, caught between these two forces, were being asked, or compelled, to choose sides. Syracuse's alignment had been with Rome, through a series of treaties that had kept the city relatively stable and safe during the early phases of the conflict. Hiero II, the king who had watched Archimedes move a ship with a pulley, had managed this relationship with considerable political skill. But Hiero died around 215 BCE. He was succeeded by his young grandson Hieronymus, who was promptly assassinated, triggering a period of internal political chaos that ended with Syracuse pivoting toward Carthage and away from Rome. From Rome's perspective, this was unacceptable. A Carthaginian Syracuse would be a strategic disaster, a base on the island directly threatening Rome's supply lines and the security of southern Italy. The Roman Senate dispatched Marcellus with a fleet and an army to bring Syracuse back under Roman control, by negotiation if possible, and by force if necessary. Negotiation was tried. It failed. The siege began in 214 BCE. Archimedes was, at this point, somewhere in his early 70s. He had spent his life working on mathematical problems, corresponding with colleagues across the Mediterranean, building the body of work that would define him. He was not a political figure. He had no official military role. The war, the political realignment, the arrival of the Roman fleet. These were external events in the world that he had spent his career largely ignoring. What brought him into the conflict was probably simpler than any formal conscription or royal command, though there may have been an element of that, too. It was most likely a request. From the city's defense planners, from people who understood that they were facing a Roman military force of formidable capability, and that they needed everything Syracuse had to apply his understanding of mechanics to the problem of defense. They knew what he had demonstrated with pulleys and levers. They knew that his understanding of mechanical force went far beyond what any conventional military engineer could match. And they were facing a siege. There is something worth pausing on in this moment. Archimedes was a man who had oriented his entire life around abstract understanding, around the question of how the world worked at a fundamental level, not around the question of how that understanding could be turned into practical advantage. He was a theorist, not an engineer. The distinction mattered to him. The ancient sources suggest he thought applied mechanics was a lesser pursuit compared to pure mathematics, something you engaged in when the situation required it, but not the real work of an intellectual life. And yet, when the situation required it, the transition from theory to application turned out to be surprisingly direct. Because Archimedes understood the principles, not just the rules of thumb. The actual principles, the precise mathematical relationships that govern how forces work, how projectiles travel, how mechanical advantage functions. And anyone who understands the principles can apply them. You do not need separate practical knowledge when your theoretical knowledge is deep enough. The theory and the practice connect, because the theory is actually about the real world. He began designing defensive machines for the walls of Syracuse. He did not do this reluctantly, exactly, but there is a quality in how the ancient sources describe this period that suggests his engagement was principled rather than enthusiastic. That he brought to the problem of military defense the same methodical precision he brought to mathematics, treating it as a problem to be solved correctly rather than as a cause to be championed. The machines Archimedes designed for the defense of Syracuse were not science fiction. This is worth being clear about, because the ancient accounts of what they did are dramatic enough that they can sound like exaggeration or myth. They were not magic. They were engineering, the systematic application of mechanical principles that Archimedes understood more precisely than anyone else alive. The catapults he designed were not new in concept. Catapults had existed for generations, and both the Romans and the Syracusans had conventional versions. What Archimedes contributed was precision and range calibration. He designed catapults that could be adjusted to different distances, depending on where the attacking ships or soldiers were positioned relative to the walls. The weapons could be tuned to hit targets at different ranges. This sounds like a small improvement, but in practice it was substantial. A defensive weapon that can be adjusted to reach specific positions as an enemy advances is far more effective than one that can only fire at a fixed range. He also designed what the sources describe as smaller, lighter catapults for use against enemies who had gotten very close to the walls, inside the range at which the larger machines were effective. This shows systematic thinking about the problem. The defense of a city from siege is not a single tactical situation, but a changing one, as the attacker moves from long range to medium range to close range, and the defender needs different capabilities for each phase. The cranes, the devices with iron hooks that could grab ships, are the most dramatic element of the accounts, and also the most technically interesting. The principle behind them was the same compound pulley and lever technology that Archimedes had been demonstrating for years. A crane arm extended over the wall, counterweighted and operated by a pulley system, with a large iron hook or iron hand on the end of a rope. The hook would be dropped onto an attacking ship's prow. The pulley system would be operated, requiring relatively few men because of the mechanical advantage involved, and the ship would be lifted at its front end, tilted, and then either dropped to capsize or simply held at an angle until the crew abandoned ship. The Romans encountered this and found it nearly incomprehensible. Not because they did not understand cranes in principle. Cranes were used in construction throughout the ancient world, but because the scale, the precision, and the systematic deployment of this capability in a military context was something they had not seen. Their tactical playbook had no entry for dealing with machines that could grab their ships from the walls and lift them out of the water. There are accounts in the ancient sources, primarily in Polybius and Plutarch, of stones being dropped on Roman ships from overhead. Large stones dropped through holes or over the side of the walls onto ships that had approached close to the base of the walls. This, too, is straightforward mechanics. A weight falling from a height carries a great deal of kinetic energy. Against a wooden ship, a large stone dropped from sufficient height is devastating. The challenge is positioning and timing, having the stones ready, having the mechanisms to drop them precisely, being able to deploy this capability quickly as ships approached. Archimedes appears to have engineered solutions for all of these logistical problems. What made the whole system more than the sum of its parts was that it was designed as an integrated defense, rather than as a collection of individual weapons. Different machines covered different ranges. The large catapults engaged ships at long distance. The medium catapults covered the approach. The cranes operated against ships that reached the walls. The dropping stones covered ships immediately below. An attacking force had to pass through multiple layers of effective fire with no safe, intermediate distance. No range at which they were out of reach of one weapon, but not yet in range of another. This kind of integrated system design is what distinguishes engineering from mere tool-making. Archimedes was not making weapons. He was designing a defense. The distinction is between optimizing individual components and optimizing the system as a whole, a distinction that requires understanding not just the mechanics of each device, but the tactical problem the whole set of devices is meant to solve. Archimedes understood the tactical problem precisely, and he designed toward it with the same systematic rigor he brought to mathematical proofs. The Romans found themselves unable to maintain conventional siege tactics. Their standard approaches, the massed ship assault, the scaling of walls with siege towers, were too costly against this defense. Marcellus was forced to give up on rapid capture and settle into a longer siege, hoping that time, supply disruption, or internal political factors within Syracuse would eventually accomplish what direct assault could not. There is a particular kind of fear that is different from ordinary fear. Ordinary fear is a response to a known threat, the enemy soldier, the approaching weapon, the physical danger whose nature you understand even if you cannot avoid it. The other kind, The fear that corrodes rather than sharpens, that makes experienced soldiers useless, is the fear of something you do not understand. The fear of not knowing what is going to happen, or where it is going to come from, or what you can do about it. The accounts of the Roman soldiers at Syracuse describe something close to this second kind of fear. Plutarch records that the Romans became so frightened that if they saw even a rope or a piece of wood projecting above the walls, they would cry out to one another that Archimedes was training some engine upon them, and run away. This is a remarkable image. Trained, experienced soldiers, veterans of campaigns, fleeing from a rope. Not because of what the rope was, but because of what it might be. The machines had done something to their understanding of what was possible. Before Syracuse, the Romans knew what siege defense looked like. They knew the weapons, knew the capabilities, knew the general shape of what they would face. That knowledge gave them a framework for making decisions under pressure, for assessing threats accurately, for responding effectively rather than reacting to every shadow. Archimedes' machines had broken that framework. Now they did not know what was coming. A rope projecting over a wall might be a crane about to grab a ship. A sound from inside the walls might be a catapult being adjusted to a new range. The experience of having faced things they could not predict and could not counter had created a generalized uncertainty that was far more psychologically damaging than any specific weapon. They had lost the ability to distinguish between real threats and their own imagination of threats. This is the psychological effect of confronting a mind that works differently from what you expect. It is not the specific things the mind produces, though those matter too, but the experience of encountering a kind of capability you did not know existed, and therefore cannot model. You cannot defend against what you cannot predict, and you cannot predict what you do not understand. Marcellus, for all the frustration expressed in his recorded remarks about Archimedes, appears to have understood this at some level. His response, abandoning the direct assault and settling into awaiting siege, was an acknowledgment that the conventional military toolkit was not adequate here. He was not facing a stronger version of a familiar problem. He was facing a different kind of problem, one that his experience had not prepared him for. The irony is that Archimedes was not, in the conventional military sense, fighting at all. He was solving problems. The defense of Syracuse was, for him, a set of engineering challenges to be analyzed and addressed with the same tools he would bring to any other problem. Understanding the principles at work, designing solutions that followed from those principles, refining and integrating the solutions into a coherent system. The psychological effect on the Romans was real, but it was a byproduct of the thinking rather than its goal. Ideas, properly understood, are terrifying to those who do not understand them, not because they are mysterious, but precisely because they are not. Because they follow from principles, and those principles can be extended in directions you have not anticipated. When you encounter someone whose thinking is operating at a level you cannot follow, you cannot predict what they will produce next. And that unpredictability, in a military context, is its own weapon. Syracuse held for 2 years. That is the measure of what Archimedes had accomplished. A city that the most powerful military force in the Western Mediterranean had expected to take quickly, that it had assaulted with overwhelming numbers and established tactics, held for 2 years, because one person understood how force and mechanics worked well enough to design a defense that conventional military experience could not overcome. In the end, Syracuse fell not through any failure of Archimedes' machines or any breakthrough in Roman siege tactics. It fell through a combination of factors that had nothing to do with the walls and the weapons. Internal political division, a negotiated betrayal, and the specific circumstances of a festival night when the city's guards were less attentive than usual. Roman soldiers found a way into the city through a section of wall that was poorly watched, and once inside the walls, the question of how to defend against the approach was moot. The fall of a city in the ancient world was a catastrophic event for its inhabitants. Marcellus, by the accounts we have, attempted to limit the violence and looting. He was reportedly moved to tears when he saw the city from a hill and thought about what was going to happen to it. Whether this reflects genuine compassion or retrospective self-portraiture by the sources is difficult to say. What is clear is that the sack of Syracuse, even if it was restrained by the standards of ancient warfare, was violent and disruptive in the way that sacks of cities always were. There is a contrast embedded in this moment that is worth noticing. The entire preceding 2 years had been a demonstration of what ordered, systematic, intelligent preparation could accomplish, how a rigorous understanding of principles could hold a vastly superior military force at bay through the consistent application of well-designed systems. And then all of that was undone not by a better understanding or a more sophisticated military approach, but by the ordinary chaos of political betrayal and momentary inattention. This is how it goes, often enough. Systems, however well designed, are operated by people. People are not always reliable in the ways that systems require them to be. The most carefully constructed defense has a human element that cannot be fully engineered away, and that human element is subject to the pressures: political pressure, personal fear, the temptation of a bribe, the exhaustion of a long siege, that eventually find the gap that logic alone cannot close. Archimedes could design machines that compensated for the strength difference between a besieged city and a besieging army. He could not design machines that compensated for the willingness of some inhabitants to open a gate. Order and destruction, thought and chaos. The 2 years of the siege had been a sustained demonstration that thought could hold chaos at bay. The fall of the city was a reminder that it cannot do so indefinitely, not because thought is insufficient, but because the world it operates in is never entirely composed of things that respond to thought. There is always a residue of accident, of treachery, of the failure of people to be what they were supposed to be. Against that residue, even the most precise mechanical system eventually runs out of answers. He was killed during the sack of the city. Archimedes was in his mid-70s by this point, old by the standards of the ancient world, and yet apparently still working, still thinking, still engaged with the problems that had occupied his entire life. The manner of his death is one of those historical moments that has generated multiple versions, none of which can be definitively confirmed, all of which converge on a central image that has the quality of something people felt needed to be preserved precisely because of what it said. The versions differ in their details. There are at least 3 distinct accounts in the ancient sources. But the most famous and most enduring says this: a Roman soldier found him, not defending himself, not trying to escape, but crouched on the ground drawing circles in the sand. The soldier apparently gave him an order: "Stand up, come with me." And Archimedes, without looking up, said, "Do not disturb my circles." The soldier killed him. This story has been interpreted in many ways across the centuries as a demonstration of Archimedes' courage, that he cared so little for his physical safety compared to his work that he refused to interrupt it even under lethal threat. as a symbol of the conflict between brute force and intellectual life. The soldier with his sword against the old man with his geometric figures. As a meditation on the relationship between the life of the mind and the violence of the world, how the world ultimately does not exempt even its greatest thinkers from its ordinary brutality. All of these readings have something to them. But there is a simpler possibility that is also worth considering, that in that moment, Archimedes was simply doing what he had always done. He was thinking. The figures in the sand were not a defiant gesture. They were not a last act of resistance. They were what he did. They were who he was, and the interruption, whatever the interruption was, soldier or storm or anything else, was simply less real to him in that moment than what he was working on. Marcellus, when he learned of Archimedes' death, was reportedly angry at the soldier who had killed him. He had intended to capture Archimedes, and had apparently given orders that he was to be found and protected. Whether this is true or his later embellishment is impossible to say. What is consistent across sources is the sense that Archimedes was understood, even by his enemies, to be a figure of unusual significance, that his death was a loss that went beyond the ordinary casualties of conquest. The tomb was built in accordance with his wishes, apparently. A sphere inscribed in a cylinder, as he had requested, marking the mathematical result he was most proud of. Cicero, writing over a century later, describes finding the tomb while serving as quaestor in Sicily, overgrown and forgotten, but still identifiable by the geometric inscription. He cleaned it up and had it properly tended. The details of this account are probably at least partly self-aggrandizing on Cicero's part, but the image is vivid. The most celebrated intellectual of antiquity, his tomb found in weeds, identified only by a mathematical diagram. His mathematical papers survived him, at least in part. Some were preserved, copied, transmitted across centuries through the complex and fragile process by which ancient texts were maintained and eventually reached the libraries of medieval Europe and the Islamic world. Some were lost. A palimpsest discovered in the 20th century, a manuscript where earlier writing had been scraped away and written over, leaving ghostly traces of the original beneath, turned out to contain Archimedes' texts that had not been known to exist, including work on what appears to be an early approach to combinatorics. As recently as the 1990s, Archimedes was still revealing things that had not been read in 1,000 years. The mind was still speaking, across the centuries, still insisting, with geometric precision, on being heard. When people summarize what Archimedes contributed to human knowledge, they usually list the inventions and discoveries, the law of the lever, the principle of displacement, the calculation of pi, the method of exhaustion, the Archimedes screw, the siege machines, the work on spheres and cylinders. The list is genuinely impressive, and each item on it represents real knowledge that has been used in real ways by real people across the centuries since. But the list misses the most important thing, because the specific results, as significant as they are not actually what Archimedes' real contribution was. His real contribution was demonstrating what was possible, showing through the example of his own work what kind of understanding could be achieved, and how. Before Archimedes, it was not fully clear that the physical world, the world of weight and balance and floating and falling and motion, could be understood mathematically in the same way that geometry could. It was not clear that the curved shapes of the physical world could be subjected to the same rigorous analysis as the straight-edged shapes of Euclidean geometry. It was not clear that mechanical phenomena, the behavior of levers and pulleys and fluids, could be derived from stated principles through logical argument rather than simply observed and described. After Archimedes, all of this was clear, not just as an aspiration or a philosophical position, but as demonstrated fact. He had done it. The work existed. You could read the proofs. You could follow the arguments. You could see in specific detail how a person who understood the right principles could reason from those principles to precise, testable, applicable conclusions about the behavior of the physical world. This is what the scientists of the 16th and 17th centuries, Galileo, Kepler, Newton, and their contemporaries, were building on when they constructed what we now call the scientific revolution. They were not starting from nothing. They were, in many cases, consciously following in the tradition that Archimedes had established, the tradition of mathematical physics, of deriving the behavior of nature from stated principles through rigorous argument. Galileo studied Archimedes closely and explicitly modeled his own approach on him. Newton's laws of motion are, in a meaningful sense, the completion of a project that Archimedes began, the project of expressing the mechanics of the physical world in the language of mathematics. The method is the legacy, not the specific results, as valuable as those are, but the demonstration that the method works, that careful reasoning about the physical world grounded in clear principles and expressed in precise mathematical terms can give you knowledge that is both theoretically rigorous and practically powerful. That the gap between pure mathematics and applied reality is smaller than it looks. That understanding a thing deeply enough means understanding how to use it, even in contexts the original investigator never anticipated. The machines that held off the Roman fleet were an expression of this. Not the machines themselves, they are long gone, but the fact that they existed, that they worked, that one person's deep understanding of mechanical principles could translate directly into effective engineering capability. That is the demonstration. That is what Archimedes proved by doing it. We inherit from Archimedes not just specific knowledge, but a way of relating to questions, the disposition to take the question seriously, to pursue it not just until you have a workable answer, but until you have an understanding that is complete enough to be stated rigorously, to believe that the world, in all its apparent complexity and messiness, operates according to principles that can be discovered by careful human thinking. To trust that the work of understanding is worth doing even when, especially when, its immediate practical application is not obvious. That disposition is the real scientific inheritance, not the specific facts that science has established, important as they are, but the conviction that facts can be established, that the world has an order, that the order can be understood, that understanding it is both possible and worth the effort. This is what Archimedes was living when he was drawing figures in sand. This is what he was defending, in his own way, when he refused to be interrupted. He didn't just change what we know about levers and circles and floating objects and the value of pi. He changed how we think about what it means to know something. He changed what kind of answer we should be satisfied with. He showed that precision was possible, that rigor was achievable, that the gap between a question and a complete, defensible, mathematically grounded answer was a gap that could actually be closed. He didn't just change what we know, he changed how we think.